Hey, book lovers. Want to hear a story? Welcome back to Storytime with M, book lovers. I am sharing the oldest book of mine that is still available for purchase. It is called Do You Remember Ella? A high school horror story. And I am breaking some of the chapters up into parts because back when I first started writing, I wrote really long chapters. And I'm glad I don't anymore. So without further ado, please enjoy Chapter 1, Part 2 of Do You Remember Ella? Headmaster Quincy was tall, lanky, and bald, with round silver glasses that were constantly slipping down his narrow nose. He was too kind to be effective in his position, and he was known for being a pushover. Mr. Franklin was another story. He was short and stocky and, as previously mentioned, bore a striking resemblance to a bulldog. He coached football and wrestling, and his temper was legendary. He openly favored his players over the other students of CA, and he had always disliked me most of all. A brainy theater nerd was the kind of student he abhorred. He pointed to a chair in front of his desk, and we all sat down. Headmaster Quincy seemed as nervous as I, and was perched on his chair lightly, as if he might decide to run at any moment. Mr. Franklin sat for a brief moment, but stood again almost immediately. He paced the small space behind his desk and glared at me. Headmaster Quincy pushed his glasses up on his nose and cleared his throat. Sophie, we have reason to believe that you know more than you are telling us. Mr. Franklin slammed his hands on his desk and made the pens and pictures rattle. Headmaster Quincy and I both jumped. Who did it? Mr. Franklin leaned over his desk. His breath smelled like onions and rot, and I almost gagged. His face was red with rage, and veins were popping out on his head and neck. When I again denied any knowledge of the culprit, Mr. Franklin exploded. This is destruction of private property, young lady. You could be in very big trouble for this. You'll be fined, and you could possibly serve time if we decide to proceed legally with the case. I didn't do anything. You've desecrated the history of this fine school. For decades, Cullen Academy has produced fine, intelligent students who go on to good colleges and bright futures. I'm sick and tired of you nerdy, artsy-fartsy types slandering this school. CA is a first-class private school, and I will not have you dragging our name through the mud. He raised his hand, and I cringed, waiting for the blow. Mr. Franklin, that is enough. Headmaster Quincy rose shakily to his feet and excused me. He closed the door behind me, and I ran for my dorm. The secretary called after me, but I didn't hear what she said. All I could see was the look of pure hatred on Mr. Franklin's face. It was bewildering, and I ran as fast as I could out of Mueller Hall. The fresh, cool air revived me a little, and I ran faster. I bounded up the stairs of the larger girls' dorm, Felicity Hall, and did not stop until I was securely locked in my room. I threw myself on my bed and sobbed into my pillow. I stayed there all afternoon, and throughout dinner. The sun was beginning to set, but I didn't move to turn on any lights. As I lay in the gathering darkness, looking at the orange glow from a lamp lighting the path between the dorms, I tried to banish Mr. Franklin's cold expression from my mind. I thought about Ella instead. Her departure had been very sudden. It was during the fall musical, and she had just landed her first role. It had brought her out of her shell a little bit, and there was even a rumor that she was dating one of the lower-ranked hockey players. He was fourth string, but just being on the team meant something to the students of Cullen Academy. His name was Brando, and he was one of the several hockey players who went out for the musical every year. Their coach encouraged it because it showed school spirit, and took place before hockey season started. Brando wasn't like most of the guys on the team. He had a soft, gentle voice and was quite funny. I'd noticed him watching Ella during rehearsals, and when he spoke to her, he always tried to make her laugh. He seemed to genuinely like her, and it was nice to see Ella smile. It was not something she did often. Ella and I were spending a lot of time together at that point. I had landed a supporting role, and any free time we had was spent going over our lines and rehearsing our songs. Though she seemed happy, she still avoided talking about herself. We talked about the show and gossiped about our castmates, but she never said anything about her own interests or about Brando's obvious attention. She was a good listener, and she spent more than one evening listening to me complain about classes and a guy named Philip who I was dating at the time. She rarely offered advice, but she was supportive and let me come to my own conclusions. I was so absorbed in my own problems that I never asked her about her life. She was a much better friend to me than I was to her. The night before she left, we spent the evening going over our lines. Ella's mood was tense and sullen. From her unsmiling expression, I recognized the beginnings of a downward shift in her emotions. She sat stiffly on the edge of my bed. Instead of her usual sweatshirt and pajama pants, she wore a pretty dress and heels. Her hair was styled, and she was wearing makeup. I'd never seen her that way, and I thought again of Brando. He stayed at her side throughout rehearsal that evening, and I saw them holding hands once when they thought no one was looking. Ella's appearance struck me as odd as I remembered that night, but I hadn't given it a second thought at the time. I was too absorbed in trying to memorize my lines to notice anything else. As I said before, I was a lousy friend. She left around midnight, and that was the last time I saw her. She seemed scared, now that I think of it. I didn't give it much thought at the time. I assumed she was nervous about the show like I was. Now I wondered if it wasn't something else. Ella was gone the next morning, and no one seemed to notice. No one even mentioned it until I went to Headmaster Quincy to report her disappearance. That was when I learned that her parents had pulled her out of school and brought her home. I expected rehearsal that night to be chaos, but it was surprisingly calm. Valeria Mennick was playing the lead role, and no one commented on the change. It seemed incredibly natural. Valeria was often cast as the lead, and the only reason she hadn't been this time was because she had been caught smoking on campus. Her role in the chorus was supposed to be her punishment. The director, Mr. Tilson, turned pale when I mentioned Ella's name and silenced me angrily. "No time for that now. The show is in 3 weeks, Sophie, and the show must go on." No one mentioned her name again. Valeria played the role flawlessly, and Mr. Tilson gushed over her performance. She was a favorite with the faculty, and Tilson had been giving her leads ever since her freshman year. He was less enthusiastic about my performance and spent the next 20 minutes pointing out my innumerable flaws. And I had to stay after rehearsal to run through my songs until he was satisfied. The computer lab was located on the floor below the auditorium, and I went there when I had finally finished rehearsal. It was a Thursday night, and I knew I would find Byron there. He was at his usual desk in the back room. His feet were propped up on the desk, and he balanced his laptop on his long legs. He stared intently at the screen, and I noticed his fingers were not touching the keys. He looked up at me unhappily as I approached. I flung my bag on the desk next to him and sat down warily. "Have you heard about Ella?" "What about her?" His eyes darted around quickly, and I knew he had heard the rumors. He leaned back in his chair and tried to act calm, but I could see the look of fear in his eyes. Ella was a dangerous subject, and he knew it as well as I did. "She's gone. Her parents pulled her out of school this morning." He didn't say anything, and his fingers tapped the keys absently. My impatience grew, and I waved my hand in front of his face to make him look at me. "Don't you think it's strange? It's the middle of the semester. The show opens in 3 weeks, and she finally had a lead. It doesn't make any sense. You know what her mom is like. Why didn't she at least wait until the show was over?" Mrs. Schuler was the definition of a stage mother, and I couldn't imagine her pulling Ella out of school right before a play, especially when she had finally gotten a lead. Especially when she finally had a lead. Mrs. Schuler was constantly dragging agents out to our school in the woods to watch Ella's performances. So far, no one had shown any interest, but Mrs. Schuler was relentless. Byron shrugged his bony shoulders. He was unnaturally thin, almost skeletal, though he seemed to be constantly eating. "Something must have happened. Maybe there was a family emergency." "Why did they come get her in the middle of the night? Why didn't she say anything to me about it last night? She didn't even say goodbye." Byron shrugged again and stared blankly over my shoulder. Mr. Robertson appeared a moment later to demand my pass. It was study hours, and I should have been in my dorm room. Mr. Robertson's bald head turned pink as I tried to explain my late rehearsal and the biology question that I just had to have Byron answer for me. He glared angrily at me and stroked his short white beard. After a moment's serious consideration, he waved me away and wedged himself between Byron and I. I turned once as I exited the computer lab, expecting to find Byron watching me. Mr. Robertson was watching me instead. His expression was so full of hatred that I ran the entire way back to my room, where I lay panting on my bed and trying to catch my breath when Mrs. Miller came to the door. She was a kind woman, and she tried to make dorm life pleasant. She wouldn't punish me for being late. She sat down in my chair, and we looked at each other for a moment. Then she sighed and left the room without a word. I think she wanted to talk to me about Ella that night, but something made her hold back. She never mentioned her again, but I saw her sitting in Ella's empty room one night. She was crying quietly and staring out the window. Then she turned suddenly and saw me. She wiped her face vigorously on her sleeve and ran from the room. I didn't speak to her after that night. She avoided me as much as possible, and her affection for me cooled. And I'd felt that loss greatly over the last year. I woke to the sound of someone pounding on my door. It was dark except for the dull orange light that slipped in between the curtains. I tried to ignore whoever it was, but they would not stop. When I finally untangled myself from my blankets and stumbled to the door, the pounding had stopped. I hoped whoever it was had gone, but when I threw the door open, I found Valeria on the other side. She wore short shorts and a tank top, her standard outfit when we weren't required to wear our uniforms. Her hair and makeup were flawless and expensive, but they did little to counteract the nasty expression she wore when I opened my door. What took so long? She shoved past me into the room and sat down on my bed. I remained by the door, still holding it partially open and staring at Valeria. We had never spoken before that moment, and I wasn't sure what I should say. She was the queen of Cullen Academy and never had to descend the social ladder to speak to a person like me. She didn't even have to acknowledge me during rehearsals, which I personally found rude and pretentious. I was stunned by her casual intrusion. I liked my space. Even people I liked had to wait to be invited in. But the queen was not going to wait. She examined her nails and looked at me impatiently. "Close the door." I did. My tongue was still numb with surprise, and I hated myself for the sudden shyness. Speaking my mind was not usually something I struggled with, and I was angry. I knew I would soon be required to say something, but my mind was blank. I couldn't think of a word. As soon as the door shut, Valeria jumped up and locked it. She returned to my bed and gestured for me to sit at the desk. Her expression was suddenly less vicious. The cold, hard glare was gone, and she nervously wrung her hands. She looked scared. "Listen, Sophie. I know that this must be a very difficult time for you, and I just wanted you to know that I'm here if you need to talk." "What are you talking about?" She shifted uncomfortably and pulled her knees to her chest. She rested her chin on her kneecaps and looked up at me through her dark hair. "I just thought you might want to talk to someone, you know? Get things off your chest. It's obvious you're still upset about Ella, and I thought, why would I be upset about Ella?" Valeria shrugged. "I didn't do it, Valeria. Why would I? Ella left school. It's not like she's dead. If I wanted to, I could find her on Facebook, but we weren't really that close." Valeria narrowed her dark eyes at me. "Look, Sophie, this has gone on long enough. I know you sent me that letter, and I don't think it's funny. At all. Can I help that I'm pretty unpopular?" "What are you talking about? What letter?" "Ruining me is not going to do anything for you. Do you know who my father is? He will sue you and your pathetic family and take everything that you have. You can't do this to me." I held up my hands and stared at her. "I really have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, right. You have no idea what I'm talking about. Does this look familiar to you?" She held a piece of bright blue paper and waved it in front of my face. It was the same electric shade as her shorts. She glared at me, and I shrugged. I'd never seen it before. She stood up suddenly and crumpled the paper. She threw it at me hard, and it bounced off my nose. She stormed out of the room, and I didn't move until the door had slammed shut behind her. I slowly bent and picked up the bright blue ball. I smoothed the paper out on my desk. The writing on it was neat and rounded. When I finished reading it, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the poster of Einstein that hung over my desk. I wasn't sure what I had before me, but it was certainly interesting. And that is the end of Chapter 1 of Do You Remember Ella? I hope you're enjoying the story so far. We are just getting started. I will be back with a new episode of Storytime and Chapter 2. Thank you so much for joining me, book lovers. I hope you have a beautiful week. And until next time, keep reading.
a Frap Media production.